My name is Veronica Parker, coordinator with CAEP Technical Assistance Project, and today's presenter is Jay Wright with CASAS. Before we get started, I'd like to check in with you all just to make sure that you're able to hear me and that you are seeing the screen. So if I can have just a couple people let me know in the chat that you are able to hear me and that you see CAEP Data Dive on your screen, that would be great. All right, great. I have people letting me know that you can hear me, so we are off to a great start. Speaking of the PowerPoint presentation, we did send out the PowerPoint presentation to all registered participants earlier this morning, maybe around 8 o'clock this morning. So if you did not receive the PowerPoint presentation, it is available for download in the chat pod. So if you scroll all the way up to the beginning of your chat screen, you should see two files that you are able to download. One is the PowerPoint presentation and one is the DIR summary handout. Both of those documents will be utilized during today's during today's webinar. So definitely be sure to access those and follow along as you see fit. If you experience any technical difficulties, whether it's downloading those documents or you run into technical issues where you are unable to see the screen or even hear the presenter, please be sure to let us know in the chat and we will be sure to private message you to reconcile whatever issues you are experiencing. So definitely be sure to let us know. Throughout the course of this webinar, questions will be answered during intermittent points within the presentation. So if you do have a question, definitely post them in the chat and Jay will get to them as we move along throughout the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the California Adult Education website, along with those two handouts that I referenced earlier. So if you have to leave for any reason, or if you need to come back to access the recording or the handouts, or you would like to share with colleagues, definitely be sure to access the California Adult Education website later on this afternoon where the materials will be posted. And I'll post the URL of exactly where those documents will be housed in the recording later on during today's webinar. We are taking attendance, so definitely be sure to let us know who you are. I see quite a few people are already doing so thank you, we appreciate you. If you have logged into today's webinar and you are using a name or an acronym, or maybe your consortium name that was not associated with your registration, definitely be sure to let us know who you are so that we can account for you accurately within our attendance. Also, if a colleague has shared the URL and the passcode for today's webinar and you did not register, again, let us know who you are so that we can account for you in our attendance. That is all that I have for now. I will now pass it over to Jay, who will get us started with today's webinar. Jay?
Hello, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. See a lot of people are in. That's great to see so many people here. We're calling this a data dive. Obviously, we're not really diving because we're all doing this virtually. I guess probably the best, I gotta say one saying I'm cutting in and out, but everybody else says I'm fine, so I will repeat it. I've gotta say, I think the person saying I'm cutting in and out is probably something on your end, because there's like 100 people saying fine and one saying I'm cutting in and out. Anyway, we're trying to do a delicate balance with this presentation. We're calling it a data dive, which kind of, to some extent does suggest like COVID-19 isn't happening. There are parts of this that quite frankly do kind of go that direction, where we're kind of pretending like it isn't happening. We're still expecting these wonderful results that because of COVID-19, we're highly, highly unlikely to be achieving right now, but we'll kind of pretend like it isn't happening and dig in like we're gonna get the best possible results, even though we know a lot of times because of all these issues the last few months we're not. We're kind of balancing it with COVID-19. So we're gonna kind of rehash some of the COVID-19 issues that we've been talking about a lot. Netta's on the team. You might remember 2 or 3 months ago, Netta and I did a lot of presentations about distance learning considerations. So we're gonna be rehashing those a little bit and then segueing into the as if it didn't happen, and to some extent doing a balancing act where some of this will just be the old standbys. I know most of you are familiar names, so a lot of you have heard these old standby routines many times, so you'll be hearing it for the umpteenth and oneth, you might say, here today. But we are going to try to provide some suggestions, knowing that we're quarantined, knowing that we're doing a lot of distance learning, knowing that we've got all these extra issues going on. we're basically going to be trying to provide some suggestions that will hopefully make it easy to try to do some data cleanup and reporting outcomes, even though we know a lot of these things have been really difficult. So next slide, please. Or maybe I can just flip it. I can't flip with my index finger, sorry. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about COVID-19's effect. That's rehashed for probably 99% of you. That second bullet is rehashed for probably 99% of you, but we will set the table to make sure everybody's aware. And then we'll kind of go from the complete opposite direction, that is looking at, what are the CAEP outcomes and services. We haven't really talked about that in a while for all the obvious reasons. So a little less obvious, but review for most of you. And then we'll get into some suggestions where we kind of need to set up the framework for CAEP reporting and how it fits into WIOAI and federal reporting, but some suggestions of, maybe workarounds where you can still report outcomes. Again, kind of in the same vein of pretending like COVID-19 isn't happening. We're also under the assumption that you might say, given the fact that you enrolled and actually attended a workshop like this, given everything that's happening anyway, that by definition, you are the coalition of the willing. So even though we know that we're, the feds are kind of holding everybody harmless, and we've heard what CDE has had to say about payment points and so on, we're still trying to do everything necessary to maximize our outcomes. So that's another way where we're kind of pretending like that's not really happening. We're basically moving forward like we're all doing everything we can. Sorry, I hit my mute button here. So anyway, we'll also look at agency and consortium reports, and we'll get into a few examples, time permitting, on some ways where we can, basically, review our data, again, to some extent pretending that COVID-19 hasn't happened. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just rehashing a lot of things that we've talked about a lot here the last few months. We've got a lot of agencies that are closed for COVID-19. We've been moving everything to distance learning. We've talked a lot about that OTAN website that's been in effect since March 13th. There's the link to that. Overall, though, the key point maybe from the state office is, despite the fact that we're all in quarantine mode and classes are closed and schools are closed, we're continuing to follow the CAEP beginning of year letter for program year 1920 that came out last August. So we're still reporting our data on or before August 1st. We're still basically, following all those same guidelines. I'll just say, paraphrasing everything for everybody, we feel like the results of everybody's data is going to be significantly impacted. So the fact that we have less tests, less outcomes, all of those kind of things kind of goes without saying, but the fundamental ability to meet these deadlines and at least physically, get your information from point A to point B should be the same. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of a review here. My guess is a lot of you probably were in Cheryl and Shay's webinar at 11. There was a big webinar that Octay did just a couple of hours ago. So paraphrasing them a little bit, they've had not one, not two, but 3 federal level memos since we've been in quarantine mode. The first one came out at the end of March. That was memo 20-3. That essentially made the whole process of remote testing allowed. I like to say the feds kind of doubled down on that in mid-April with memo 20-4. And you might say they tripled down on this in late May. The one in late May kind of took the extra step of providing some provisional placement where you can place learners without a pretest. You need the pre-post to make gains, but you can at least place students in levels. But again, we're setting our CAEP reporting to NRS, which is basically from what Octay says. So, here's some federal memos for your entertainment if you want, but the most recent one in 20-5 does kind of open the window on next year without getting into much detail. I'll just say the federal webinar a couple hours ago was very similar. Next slide, please. Okay, so the summary again, overall, the reporting that we have for WIOAI NRS has not changed. All states still report to the feds as always. There's a concept called force majeure that we've talked about a lot the last couple months. Making a long story short, the feds require all states to report on students unable to perform, unable to test due to COVID-19. So there's a checkbox that's been in TE for a couple months now. What we've been saying on that is the checkbox exists, but the short answer is at the agency level, you need to do nothing. There is a CDE policy on force majeure, but part of that is directing us at CASAS to apply the specific conditions here a month or so from now after everybody submits data. So you don't need to do anything on that. But the bottom line is for 1920, the feds are definitely admitting that there's going to be a lot of issues with these results, a lot of difficulties at the agency and state level. So we're going to, need to be able to report that some students just won't be able to report data like usual. There's also an issue with remote testing prior to all this. All testing had to be done with a face-to-face proctor present. Now remote testing is allowed. They're letting each state decide whether to allow it or not. California's obviously checked the box that says yes. And then we've submitted our remote testing plan, complete with that agency remote testing agreement, to the feds as well. The updated memo at the end of May, 20-5, it allows for self-reporting into a level. So that's mostly looking forward at 2021, knowing that, hey, we're moving into the new year, but there's no end in sight to COVID-19. So they are not really coming up with rules for 2021, but they are bending them a little bit, you might say, for placement, where normally federal rules say a pre-test is required to place into those federal levels. Now they're saying because of all the issues with COVID-19, you still need a pre and post to report a measurable skill gain, but you can, however, place a student into one of those 12 federal levels without a pre-test. You can use things like teacher judgment, past history, informal assessment, writing samples, etc., to place a student into the appropriate class and level so you can move forward and still provide the individual instruction. So next slide, please. Okay, this is big time rehash. This is from Penny's PowerPoint. This is just the official federal definition of distance education, to which we've all moved. Any learning activity where students and instructors are separated by time, geography, or both. I kind of like that as the basic, easy way of doing it. The easy way of defining it. You can see some of the fine print, so to speak, is, down there below, but I think I'll leave it at that and move to the next slide. And then this is another rehash a lot since mid-March. The short answer, prior to COVID-19 is you've got distance learning students. The requirements for them are no different than anybody else. What NRS has had since about 2009 is what I like to call the 50% rule. It simply acknowledges that most students in distance learning are really blended learning. Maybe not with COVID-19, but the prior 10 years before that, that was true. So the feds have always had what they called, or since 2009, had what they call the 50% rule. Simply put, more than 50% of the instruction distance learning, you mark it. If it's less than 50% distance learning, you do not mark it. And thereby, if it's more than 50%, there is a field in TE under special programs simply called distance learning that you mark if the student has more than 50% distance learning. And I already got through talking about force majeure. There's a new checkbox. No, you don't need to mark it. If you couldn't stand it and you marked it anyway, no harm, no foul. But do know whatever you mark is just going to get overwritten by CASAS because we've already been directed by the state to market at our level once we receive everybody's end of year data. Next slide, please. So just finalizing some of our DL considerations. We've talked a little bit about creating classes. We've talked a little bit about recording instructional hours and a little bit about remote testing. So for class creation, don't want to go into all these gory details. We've had a good 10 or 12 workshops talking about this since mid-March, but we've had two ways: pick up where you left off and create brand new classes, basically saying you have two different strategies for this. Pick up where you left off just means using all those class records you already created, but then figuring out for each of those classes whether it's more than 50% distance learning or less than 50%. The other strategy, if you don't want to do that, is just close out all those classes. So this would suggest you probably closed out all your classes in mid-March, created brand new classes in late March, early April when you moved to distance learning. So you had one class record that was not distance learning through March, and another one that was marked as 100% distance learning since late March, early April, or whenever you pick that back up. Next, please. We've talked a lot about hours. This is straight from NRS. Clock time, teacher verification, learner mastery. That is 3 different ways of recording hours if you're implementing distance learning. Clock time is the simplest, following the clock. That is an hour of instruction in the classroom is exactly equal to an hour of instruction in distance learning. Generally, we've been recommending clock time for synchronous instruction. That's essentially what we're doing right now. That is, the instructor and students are all delivering and receiving the information at the same time. So if the teacher is just delivering distance learning instruction via Zoom, Tuesday, Thursday morning at 10, and all the students are dutifully showing up Tuesday, Thursday morning at 10, you know, that hour of instruction via distance learning is exactly the same as if they were in the regular classroom. Other times when students are doing asynchronous instruction, that is, they're watching videos, they're using educational software, maybe it's by Zoom, but they're reviewing Zoom recordings rather than hearing it live. That is asynchronous. We're using learner mastery primarily in California. That is, we are working as a team ahead of time, figuring out how long it takes that unit in the software or that unit watching the video or whatever is taking, coming up with something ahead of time and then recording that uniform number for all students equally so we can make sure that all students are getting the same amount of hours for the same amount of instruction. Next slide, please. And then we've done a lot of remote testing. We had some big webinars in late April, early May on this one. Again, the feds are leaving it up to each state. California, as I said, is enthusiastically checking that box labeled yes, we're all in. We're going in on remote testing. So Carolyn Zachary and Linda Taylor did some webinars there in early May talking about those procedures. Lots and 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 lots of information on our CASAS website with all kinds of videos, PowerPoints, instruction guides, and so on. Also, that agency test agreement. There's that CDE memorandum on all the official state policies. All of that information is at that link if you need to know more related to remote testing. Next slide, please. So again, we're not doing a DL training here. We're doing a CAEP outcomes training. But again, it's kind of a big elephant to ignore to pretend that COVID-19 and all this quarantine mode isn't happening. So a quick recap to make sure everybody knows the context. So we're sticking with things you already know. This is a slide that's been an oldie but goodie since the fall of 2016, summarizing CAEP outcomes, AB 104, 6 areas of CAEP outcomes. If you haven't heard it in a while, well, here you go. 6 different categories. So we've got the 6 categories as specified by AB 104. We've got some case-specific outcomes under each of those 6 categories. My guess is 99% of you have probably seen this slide more than 10 times. The over-under for the average participant here is probably closer to 25, where we've gone over AB 104 listed the categories, and listed the specific outcomes, just like you can see on this slide. Next one, please. Digging in a little bit deeper, here's the literacy gains area. This is an area that we've delved into a little bit more. This is the area with all the different, what you might call measurable skill gains. I'll, go off on a tangent and say that Cheryl Keenan and Jayla Master presented a slide that wasn't this one, but looked a heck of a lot like it at the federal level just a couple hours ago, looking at all the ways where you can report these gains, the way you do it at the federal level, not so coincidentally, very similar to the way you can do it in CAEP. So for that area, we've called them literacy gains, where you can report gains through pre-post, through high school credits. You can, on the college side, there's a certificate, and there's also ways where you can report CTE related outcomes. In CAEP land, we've called that occupational skills gain and workforce preparation. Next slide, please. So the main way we do this, and what we've emphasized, obviously, is using pre and post testing. It's safe to say, since we've done CAEP reporting, the overwhelming majority of our literacy gains statewide have been through pre and post testing, through all the obvious reasons, because we know with COVID-19, that's been a big issue for 99.9% of us. We just want to point out there are other ways of reporting gains. If you haven't gotten on board with remote testing yet, maybe you've gotten on board, but you found it, difficult for a lot of your students. I've been to a lot of meetings. I've heard millions of reasons, not literally millions, but not that it's an exaggeration, but not much of one, of different reasons why that remote testing has been difficult, why doing that standardized assessment in particular has been one of the thorniest areas of continuation given everything related to COVID-19. So we're looking at alternative ways. One is high school credits. This is one we've been talking about for at least 3 years now, but it's one that maybe gets received by deaf ears usually, because that, in normal times, you're doing lots and lots and lots of pre and post testing anyway. But this is just for higher level students, admittedly. I'll say Cheryl admitted exactly that when the feds did their presentation, that yeah, this helps, but only with your higher level ABEASE, where if they're in high school and they move from the 9th or 10th grade level to 11th or 12th grade level, you can go into student records and TE and mark them as ASE low upon enrollment, and then mark them as ASE high sometime later in the year to show that they've made gains through high school credits. Again, this will only work with a small portion of your students, but for those students who are in high school diploma, you might say something is better than nothing. This is something you might want to consider looking into in more detail if you know that you're not reporting a lot through pre-post for all the obvious reasons. Here's the screenshot that shows the directions for how you can mark that outcome. Next slide, please. So here's clarifying the workforce-related outcomes that, again, we've had in place for the same amount of time. One called occupational skills gain, one called workforce prep outcome. A lot of you, I'm sure, are getting tired of hearing this. At the beginning of CAEP, this was one of the single most confusing issues in our presentation. It continues to be one that a lot of people get confused by, but we'll just clarify it a little bit for that reason and a little bit to segue into more suggestions. But again, we've had two what we call CTE related outcomes: occupational skills gain, workforce prep milestone. Occupational skills gain, we've said, is something that you can mark when a student accomplishes a portion of a longer term program, whereas workforce prep outcome suggests full completion of something shorter term. So the example for occupational skills gain would be the students in a 5-semester long welding program. We'll just say they have finished Unit 1, Module 1 in the first semester. They've passed some sort of exam that you put in place for the student to show that they're completely good to go with Module 1. So they're ready to move on to Module 2. So as such, that would be a good time to show occupational skills gain where they've made significant achievement within that longer term certificated program. Workforce prep outcome, an example here is they're enrolled in a 15-hour workforce preparation course on job search strategies. So the student completes the full 15-hour course. They're still alive at the end of it. So that might be a time when you could award them a workforce prep milestone to show that they completed something shorter term. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions here, much to my surprise. Okay, are you, this is from a while ago. I'll just make sure, is everybody hearing me okay? Yes, my volume was weird about 10 minutes ago because I moved out of a high volume area. I should be okay now, hopefully. But yes, I had to move. And when I did so, I went through my infamous wind chime area. So you all got a blast of my wind chimes about 5 or 10 minutes ago because I was moving to a lower volume area. That's what you're referring to, full disclosure there. Okay, let's go to next slide. It sounds like everybody's still riveted, or at least that's your story and you're sticking to it. So we'll move on. So again, the passage of exam for occupational skills gain. Again, partial completion of a long-term program. Number one, what we really talked about last fall was that passage of an exam. That seems kind of trivial now with all this, but we were just saying, yeah, there should be some kind of an exam, but we're also reiterating here, here's the specific TE bubbles that you mark if you're intending to mark occupational skills gain. Again, you can mark these two outcomes under update record field 9. I think we can go to next slide. And here's similarly, again, this is similar type of outcome, but here we're talking about full completion of a short-term course. Again, they do a 15-hour workforce prep course, and they're still hanging in there. So here's what you can mark if the person does that. Again, similar process in TE, but again, you remember there 3-4 years ago, we made command level decisions just to make sure that everybody was marking things consistently. No, it doesn't have to be a CTE class. I'll just say for that first example with occupational skills gain, I've got to say I would expect it to be CTE, maybe not all the time, but certainly the majority of the time. But there's nothing in writing that mandates that. For workforce prep milestone, quite frankly, I would expect it to be workforce preparation more often than CTE. If it's in CTE, it's certainly 100% A-OK, but it goes without saying, especially with that workforce prep milestone, that it will be frequently be something outside of CTE. Okay, good question. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, and so here we're veering off. So what we've done, whether it was DL or CAEP outcomes, is it's all pete and repeat. I've said absolutely nothing. I've said absolutely nothing new to date. But again, we're now aligning these literacy gain outcomes. So again, by literacy gains outcomes, that's a few slides ago. Pre-post, high school credits, occupational skills gain, workforce prep milestone. So we're now opening a new window here where we're saying, yeah, literacy gains is the category within those 6 that we've outlined for CAEP programs overall, where we think there might be the most leeway to open the window for outcomes for learners in distance learning. So one thing is, this is a way where you might backtrack. So for example, you might have lots of students that achieve, workforce prep milestones. But if you're doing a really good job with pre and post testing, a lot of you know this already, the quite frankly is it's not really that important to record every stinking workforce prep milestone if you're testing students, because they'll already get that literacy gains outcome recorded by making that pre-post gain. A lot of this is with workforce prep and CTE students in mind, a lot of ways, because we know you're not testing those students. So the idea is for ABE-ESL, you record gains by pre and post testing. For workforce prep and CTE, you record gains by looking at things like occupational skills gain. So now that COVID-19 hit, and we know that we're now all of a sudden unexpectedly going to have a big number of students who don't necessarily have a pre-post test pair, and thereby don't necessarily have a pre-post test gain, you might want to double back and look at some of those and say, yeah, lots of these students did things like complete EL Civics COAPs, complete, things like CPR training or OSHA training, or things that don't really count as a certificate, but are nonetheless meaningful things that at least suggest that they achieved a milestone, that they did do something instead of nothing. So one thing you can do, and again, not required, but again, the fact that you're here in the first place suggests that you're that coalition of the willing, that you're trying to get every outcome possible. If you're looking to do that, and again, I'm saying you are because you're here in the first place, one way where you can increase that is look at those students in ABE and ESL who maybe didn't get the pair, but perhaps did. Again, they did some of those extra, workforce prep trainings that don't count for anything other than this, but you might want to count it, that maybe completed EL Civics COAPs and so on, double back and get them. And you can use that passage of exam process that we just talked about for those MSGs, primarily related to CTE, as a guide for recording student achievement. So again, they might pass an informal exam. Maybe it's those virtual assessments that you're doing for DL courses. Maybe it's those virtual assessments that I know a lot of those educational software products build into the software. We've been talking lots and lots and lots and lots and lots about those the last few months as a way to make sure that your students are really getting those hours. When we talk about learner mastery, we say, yeah, the student should pass something just so we know that they really and truly did those units in the software and are not just pretending to do so. So you do something that just shows that they did that. Again, most of those higher end educational software products go way out of their way to have little quizzes at the end of each module that are obviously perfectly aligned to the content that they just went through learning. So if they pass something like that, if you can see that they pass something like that that represents a decent amount of instruction, that would be another really good example of recording workforce prep milestone. And then again, if they do any of these skills demonstrations and workforce prep activities, a lot of you are saying you're still doing that. Some are saying you're doing that more often than not now because you're not able to get pre and post testing like you're normally allowed to do. So I'll just say a lot of you anecdotally are doing all of these things anyway and are doing it because you really need to record the hours. So if you're doing all these things to record the fact and demonstrate that the students really are achieving distance learning and they really are achieving things like workforce preparation skills, a good way to just formalize that is by recording this in your CAEP data. And again, if they're doing things like educational software, I would argue that a lot of those, by definition, they're doing learner mastery type exercises, and they're already passing a series of informal exams, just like we're saying, and just like the feds are saying, are required for these outcomes by passage of an informal exam. So I'm just going to stop here. I'm kind of crazy because we have way too many people, but because I'm getting into kind of a quirky little point here, does everybody follow me, yes or no? Against my better judgment, I'm going to ask everybody to make sure we're clear on all this. 4 hours, I'll just say, there's nothing in writing, but obviously they'd need to at least have 12 hours to qualify. So I'll just say for things like workforce prep milestone, that by definition is shorter term. So there's no real minimum number of hours for this, but they would need to at least have 12 just to make the map. So I'll just say conveniently enough, that probably does a pretty good cutoff. I'll just add one thing I am going to outline is a real low-hanging fruit, super duper obvious example is the Civics co-ops, which I know a lot of you have been doing. That's been working a lot better with remote testing than pre and post tests are anecdotally. That's been working well. So if you're doing that, that requires 30 hours. So there's certain things that have a built-in hours already tied to it. Civics has 30 hours. A lot of those more official workforce, short-term trainings have a different number attached to it, but they already say you need at least X number of hours before you can even attempt certain things. So a lot of that is built in. I've got to say, Adrian, that your question really depends on what exactly the student is doing. Maybe I don't understand your question correctly, but if I think I do, and there's no silver bullet answer, it really depends on what you're doing to your question. Okay, next slide, please. I would say I'm going to answer your question, Karen, the way I've answered a lot of these DL questions. That sounds like a good workforce prep milestone to me. I will say that no, that does not count under high school credits. So the workaround I would say to that somewhat cynically is use it as a workforce prep milestone, not high school credits, even though common sense overwhelmingly dictates the exact opposite of that would make more sense. That is, for high school credits, the feds go out of their way to say it's got to be based on credits, not HSE subsections, so you really need to avoid that. But for workforce prep milestone, with all of these workarounds we're talking about related to COVID-19, sure, I might suggest that you put that in writing somewhere, like in your local assessment policy. If you don't put this there, then you should have an alternative policy. Most people would say, well, yeah, the local assessment policy is easiest, so that's what we would use. So I'll just say, yeah, put it in your local assessment policy. Connie, your question is exactly like Karen's question that I just addressed. Okay, so next, okay, it's here. So again, they pass a virtual assessment, written assignment, or oral interview. So again, I've used that learner mastery example. If you've got a quiz that you're building because you want to be able to credit students with hours, that would be one good way to show that they've done passage of an exam. If they're passing all that stuff that's built into educational software, I know I anyway have gone way out of my way to try to recommend that you use those assessments that they have in the software as much as possible. It's built in, it requires less work for you. Obviously, it's very strongly and very adeptly aligned with the content that's in the software. So that would be another great way to record that students are learning and they're making great, not only are they learning and making great progress, but they're passing exams that record that progress very well. And then the other one I'll just call local program milestones, where, again, if you're doing workforce preparation, or a lot of you have now started looking at that more because you're doing distance learning, a lot of realignment of which classes they really belong in. If you're doing any of that locally, that would be another real good way to record these outcomes. And I'll just say again, no, this is not Jay Wright saying that every time you want to do learner mastery and credit distance learning hours that you've got to take all these extra steps to record it as milestones for CAEP reporting. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I really am bringing it up as more of a coalition of the willing, where if you're attending this, you're saying, yeah, I want to come up with additional creative ways to record outcomes. I want additional creative ways to show that we've really worked hard at our agency, and more importantly, that our students have responded very strongly and worked really hard despite everything. We want to show that they're doing that. I'm just trying to give you some creative ways to record exactly that, knowing that some of our conventional ways, like getting jobs and pre-post gains and increased wages and all these things that we'd normally use to record this success, may not be at your disposal like they are in quote unquote normal times. So next slide, please. Okay, so another thing you might consider is a skills demonstration. So I'll go out of my way to point EL Civics out as an obvious example. Obviously, mostly you're worried about EL Civics on the WIOAI side with payment points and all that. Obviously, just like a lot of these other things, that's kind of changing a little bit this year. But a lot of you have been moving forward with doing EL Civics. In particular, a lot of you have been moving forward with doing those EL Civics co-aps remotely. I'll just say anecdotally, that's been a much better success story than the remote pre-post. Most of you have found that to be a lot easier and so on. Sometimes they're just oral interviews and so on. So if you've moved full speed ahead with things like that, by all means, especially if it's in things like COAP 33 employment or COAP 48 digital literacy or whatever, there's certain ones that are more appropriate than others. But overall, if you've got ESL students or students in other programs completing these COAPs, that's another really good way to record literacy gains and show that your students are still achieving important outcomes, even though they may not be able to complete a pre-post pair. Transitions is another good one, where if you've moved them on, you've moved them, to ASE, you've moved them to CTE or workforce, prep or whatever, that's another good one. Some of you are also doing EL co-enrollment. So if you've got people that have moved on, maybe they're still in ESL, maybe they've moved forward from ESL and they're in WIOAI and they're doing some workforce related activity there, that would be another really good opportunity for you to show that they're making literacy gains in the area of workforce preparation. Again, lots of wonderful things our students are doing. Again, we're just coming up with a number of ways that are on the up and up that clearly represent meaningful, useful, reportable outcomes, but just might be things that we're not really thinking about as much because we normally handle this through employment, through pre and post testing, etc. Next slide here, please. I'll just say, am I missing questions? Right, that's a good example. I'll just say, your Aztec example is just like what I'm talking about. Obviously, lots of these educational software products have this. Aztec is a great example. They've got lots of built-in exercises or quizzes in those modules. Yes, I'm suggesting when students pass those quizzes, that's a good way to record it. I would recommend that if you're doing it that way, to put it in writing, set very firm benchmarks at the agency level to where it's not all willy-nilly and whenever the teacher or the student says so, but you have very clear-cut guidelines at the agency level to show that. I'll just say, I feel like OTAN and CASAS have both kind of gone way out of their way to point this out, that you can do this when recording distance learning hours. We've had lots of trainings that go into gory detail and then some on how you can use this kind of information to record hours for your distance learning students. So in very similar fashion, you can use that same analysis to record workforce preparation hours or workforce preparation outcomes for your distance learning students. So Adrian, yes, this is what I mean, although I will go out of my way to say no. Karen's question was about GED subsections, so her question was completely different than what you're talking about, Adrian. Karen, yeah, so I'll just say this has not necessarily been something that's been in writing all along, and it's a gotcha. But I'm saying this now, that again, we're looking for additional creative ways to where we can record more outcomes for our students, knowing that if we rely on pre and post testing, these outcomes are going to be at a slow trickle. If we rely on employment outcomes, they're going to be at a slow trickle. So we're trying to just come up with things that we know most students are already doing, are already excelling in. Sometimes it's outcomes that they probably achieved a few months ago, but we just didn't record because, again, we went through the motions just assuming they'd make gains through pre and post. We assume they'd make gains by making wage increases or getting a job or whatever. But now we're in COVID-19, so we know those things are way less likely to happen. We still know that even though some of those things are not happening, there's still all kinds of wonderful things that are happening. So we're trying to give you ways in your data to show that, to show how it will show up and align with the system we already have for CAEP AB 104 reporting already. And we can still, through you, the coalition of the willing, still have a way to show that our students are achieving meaningful outcomes, even though some of the obvious things that we normally use to show exactly that are not necessarily at our disposal right now. So that was kind of a haughty, long way to Tipperary way of explaining it, but hopefully that explains what we're doing here. Not sure if it does or doesn't. Anyway, next slide. Thank you, Veronica. No, I'm sorry, back to that one. I said thank you because you beat me to the punch there. Sorry about that. So again, transition is another one. I have to say mixed results really on this one. Some of you are reporting this as being a really common thing that's been accelerated. Others of you are saying you got to be kidding me. This has come to a grinding halt like some other things. But if you're transitioning students, that's another good way to report outcomes. Some of you are saying, yeah, we're doing more transitions because we're trying to move them along because of all these employment related issues and so on with COVID-19. Others of you are saying, yeah, CTE programs are closed. WIOAI options are limited. A lot of you are saying those employment related programs are the exact ones that have been affected the worst because of COVID-19. But for those of you maybe where you're differing with that opinion, lots of transition outcomes that still might apply to your students. Here's all the ways you can transition to ASE, transition to post-secondary or CTE, or transition to college. And here's all the ways you can mark it in your data. Next slide. I would say again, sticking with my coalition of the willing related cliches that no, it's not required that you do all this legwork, but assuming you are coalition of the willing and your objective is to come up with as many ingenious ways as possible to show student outcomes, well, yeah, that would be another good idea that you could kind of, another leaf you could turn over or whatever is, yeah, sure, if you're looking at trying to get more employment outcomes, and for now you've just been relying on self-report, with the update record or whatever, sure, that would be another layer of outcomes you could try to shake out of the tree, so to speak, where sure, if you're getting surveys that they got a job 2 quarters after exit, by all means, that would be something you could go in and record. Sure, they exited back in December, and now they're saying, yeah, here 2 quarters after exit, they got a job. By all means, that would be a legitimate way. But yeah, it would suggest for CAEP anyway that you'd have to go back and just say got a job. So yeah, that's not what I'm offering up here, but sure, Connie, that would be another, way to record more outcomes if you're looking to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're also just looking at services. So here's just a rehash here. So supportive services are the ones that work more on helping with personal needs more so than professional or educational needs. So supportive services are things like transportation, health care, legal or fiscal counseling, and so on. That is services that help the individual with their personal issues so they can get that out of on their instruction. Versus we have, next slide, sorry, training services, which are more related to what the student is doing, with their training, with their, education program and so on. So these would be like prerequisites to move to WIOAI, or if you, had certain skills that you needed to enroll in a particular CTE class or workforce program, that would be training services. Next slide. And then transition would be more direct, would be a lot like training services, but they're more directly related with transitioning to, workforce training or transitioning to college. Next slide. This is all review, by the way. So what we're saying is there's a lot of things you could potentially add in the services side too. I probably should have brought this up before I got into those rudimentary definitions you've heard a million times, so sorry about that. But what we're saying here is there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things that we've been hearing about in the last few months that you've all been doing, sometimes because of COVID-19, other times despite COVID-19, but lots of things that have been happening at a lot of the colleges and schools where, again, you know, services are something we don't look at a lot for NRS or payment points, but we do look at them a lot more often for CAEP. So if you're providing, you know, some of these examples, healthcare needs have been a big one. Obviously, we're in a pandemic, so a lot of you have had to refer students to healthcare services. If you've been doing that sort of thing, please mark it. Financial services with everybody losing their job, another one that a lot of you might be doing. A lot of us have all been taking a crash course in distance learning. Sometimes that's us, sometimes that's our teachers, sometimes it's our students. So if we've had to provide our students a crash course in distance learning to keep the boat afloat, that would be a good example of assisting with technical services, skill upgrades to work remotely. If we've been doing that with our students, that's another area where we might want to record. And then obviously now that so many people are out of a job, we've probably had more to do with job seeking skills. So the possibilities are endless here. These are just examples that I think are all pretty stinking obvious examples that relate to things that we might be doing a lot lately because we're in COVID-19. Next slide, please. So this is the same exact information, but more from a mechanical TE perspective. So the previous slide gives more real-time examples of what we're doing at our agency. So these are just examples on the bubble form or in the TE software: prerequisite training, assessment or testing, job readiness, emergency financial services, healthcare services, some very specific examples of bubbles or check boxes that you would mark in TE that relate directly to some of these things that a lot of you have been doing with your students, whether you like it or not, or your students like it or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're transitioning. I'll just say any questions now. I'm having a hard time believing there's not questions, but I guess I'll just stick to it and move on. So here's the CAEP summary, going back to a slide you've all seen probably 25 times or more. Here's the CAEP summary. I always like to say 3 reports in one: literacy gains with your pre-post information on the left, information about all your other CAEP outcomes in the middle, information about short-term services to the right. And as we've explained for a long time now, it just represents 3 different bars where we've got a high bar related to pre-post, you know, a slightly lower bar if you're looking at all those outcomes that are not pre-post, and then a much lower bar if all you're trying to do is report up on short-term services. So next slide, please. So related to that, we've got the CAEP data integrity. So again, it's got 27 data elements. You know, we've got that those percentages based on that information that's up to, at the top. Next slide. I don't want to get into this slide, but I will get into the next one. So here's all that information up at the top. Some of you have heard this way too many times, I'm sure, but I always dwell and perseverate on this information at the top. I continue to believe that if you understand what's going on with the summary information at the top, the CAEP DIR makes lots of sense. It's very easy to understand, but if you don't know what all this is going on at the top, it's pretty close to impossible to understand what's going on with the rest of the report. So again, it seems like it's taking a lot of extra steps unnecessarily sometimes when you look at this report at the top, but I'm here to tell you it is 125% necessary You've got to reconcile all this so you can calculate those percentages. We strongly feel without the percentages, the DIR, quite frankly, really is a big stinking waste of time if we can't calculate those percentages and calculate them all equally. So we go way out of our way to set it up so we can report all these percentages the same way. So every time you look at any percentage on this DIR, it's apples to apples. So all we're basically doing is starting with that low-hanging fruit, looking at that services section, collecting everything possible. We're basically looking at those that are not assigned to a CAEP program. And then bad example here, same bad example I guess I've had. But anyway, we're discounting everybody that's not, in these CAEP programs. Maybe some people that we might want to look at more at our attention where, yeah, they're not in one of the 7 CAEP programs, but oh, by the way, they happen to get a job or they happen to make a transition or whatever. So down below that, where we have the zeros, are just ones where we might have had an outcome slip through the wickets. So we're going to subtract those not enrolled. So this is just, the math is easy. 1318 minus 4 is 1314. So we're deleting those 4, and then we're deleting the concurrents. We're coming up with that resulting number of students who are really and truly eligible for the DIR. So that 1309 is final. We're basically computing all towards that 1309 number. That is, so every time we compute information on the DIR, we're doing it the same way for all students in our database. Next slide, please. So what you asked for is, you didn't want me to go on and on and on about the same information we've been talking about for 3 years. You wanted something new. So I went through that just to make sure everybody understands the DIR before moving in. I'll reference, there's a second handout that Veronica sent everybody at the beginning. One was this PowerPoint we're talking about. Another is way too detailed for us to get too into it here, but I'll just say there is some good information in that second document where it basically takes that basic document we've been using for a long time that lists all the items on the DIR, gives some basic information on what it covers, just like the document has always done, but it weighs in a little bit more on what type of numbers you might expect to see related to COVID-19. So the short answer, of course, is some items on the DIR, you are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because of COVID-19. There's a lot of scenarios where your numbers on the DIR are probably going to look bad. And the quite frankly is, it's because of COVID-19. The second, quite frankly, is because it's because of COVID-19, you probably have a limited number of options, if any at all, to address the issue. So certain items you just have to live with. Hey, it's COVID-19. We just have to live with the fact that our data is not going to look very good. Other things where COVID-19 theoretically shouldn't be a big issue. So here's a list of things that we think might change. Obviously, that 12 hours of instruction issue. If you had students enroll in January, February, and everything came to a screeching halt on March 1, well, sure, you're going to, like it or not, probably have a lot more students than usual that ended up with less than 12 hours of instruction. The pre and post testing, obviously, we're all going to have way higher numbers there, or most of us are. I know there's also a lot of issues with the diploma and the GED, HSE especially, a lot of issues with that, just like we've had at CASAS. That's testing. It's required a lot of heavy lifting to move it to distance learning. So I know that's another area that's been affected significantly. And then we're also looking at these items from 23 to 27. In this case, if you're looking at 23 to 27B, that is, did they achieve the outcome? We know that that's one that's going to be affected because we know there's probably going to be fewer wage increases and fewer earned employments than usual. The one about earned outcome but did not qualify, That one we're putting in italics and putting on both lists because it kind of depends on the drop reason. So let's go next slide, please. So here are things that we don't really think should matter much. All those demographics, you should be able to collect that at intake. If you're moving to distance learning, you should still be able to record all this stuff at intake. So gender, race and ethnicity, date of birth, that's the sort of stuff that really shouldn't be affected. The numbers on those areas should be kind of the same as usual. Things like goals shouldn't really change much. Barriers to employment shouldn't really change much. There's that issue in italics, that is they earn the outcome that they didn't qualify. I've got to say in most cases that should still be something you can manage all right. If they're dropped because of missing date of birth, missing gender, missing race and ethnicity, that really shouldn't be much different because of COVID-19. All that said, you probably will have more people that have that show up in the 23A to 27A. I'll say mostly that might happen because of the 12 hours of instruction. So if everybody gets lost because of the 12 hours issue, then I'll admit, then you might have some COVID-19 related casualties in that area. Okay. I don't think there's really going to be updated versions. I don't think it's going to, quite frankly, I think we'll go out of our way to avoid editing the data. So I got to say, without knowing what I'm talking about, I'm going to say no. I don't see that edited thing happening in any way, shape, or form, but you may want to check in with the state, not my decision, but certainly getting an item count of the number of boxes that were checked is something that I don't think there's been a decision on what we will or will not provide. So I'm going to cover myself there, but knowing, what the numbers are in terms of how many were reported by agency as force majeure is something we probably will. Okay, hopefully the attachment is a help. Thank you. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions, so let's move on to the next slide. I'll just summarize by saying, if you're looking at the DIR, it's well understood. You've got funny numbers. There's a lot of numbers you can't do anything about, but it probably does cut against the grain when you're in the coalition of the willing to just ignore it. So there's, kind of one laundry list of items where you might just want to ignore it anyway, and another laundry list where you should still follow up because it shouldn't be much different. Okay, we're looking real good on time. So here's another transition, another slide everybody's seen a million times. This is just showing the TE drill down where, like always, it's data dives. So we're suggesting, using the drill down capabilities and the right clicking capabilities in TE. Really, really good idea. So you double click the number and that gives you a list of exactly that many. So here we're clicking on our 102 ESL enrollees at this agency. Not so coincidentally, we're getting exactly 102 students. Next slide. We've got lots of right-click options. I'm not going to detail every single option here, but I'll just say with the CAEP summary, with the CAEP DIR, with all CAEP reports, with pretty much all TE reports, there's a number of right-click options where you can look at your data in many different ways. In this example, using the CAEP summary, we've got six different listers and six different reports for which you can drill down and follow up more information on what you're seeing in your CAEP summary report. Next slide, please. We've also talked a lot about consortium reports. My guess, a lot of you have maybe weaned away from this because of COVID. Now that we've got the deadline coming up, maybe a few of you might wean back to it a little bit. Again, this has been mostly the same as last year, but we've got the 3 reports options. If you log in at the consortium level, you can look at the demographics, you can look at barriers to employment, you can look at the CAEP summary. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. I don't want to get too into this. Again, we've talked a lot about this the last few years, but here's that demographics. This is just showing you what it looks like. where again, we get, in this case, it's the demographic summary. So it's summarizing demographics for all the agencies in our consortium. It gives you agency by agency, item count and percentage by agency ID. And then over here, it gives you that gray column where it's summarizing that item count and percentage for the entire consortium. Next slide. Okay. We also have the CAEP summary and barriers to employment. It gives a lot of rundowns now that it didn't do before. I'm just showing you that these are other ones that we can review. Whether you're looking at the summary, whether you're looking at demographics, or whether it is barriers to employment, there's a checkbox in the setup window for all of these called click aggregate multiple agencies. I believe by default, that box will be checked. So what that's doing is you can run these consortium level reports in two different ways. If you run it with this aggregate multiple agencies checked, what that's doing for you is saying, yeah, we can, we want to get one set of reports that aggregates the data for our entire consortium. If we leave it unchecked, then we're going to just get separate pages for each agency, and it's going to give us multiple pages if we've got 10 agencies in our consortium. That if it's unchecked, it will give us a 10-page report, 1 page for each of the 10 agencies in our consortium. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're tying this in. So this is sort of like our examples in data dive sessions we did about a year ago. A year ago, I'm sure a lot of you, because I know most of you have been in a lot of these, we did some of those regional trainings last April and May where we did some heavy duty data diving. So we had those regional trainings in April, May last year for all the obvious reasons. We didn't do that this year. So we're trying to get into some of this. So we're getting into a few of these examples. We're selecting certain ones that we think might have some relevance remaining. And then we're kind of looking at it from a COVID-19 era perspective. So the first example, this should look familiar if you've done a lot of this, where in this case, the number of CAEP outcomes is lower than expected, and especially low when compared to the number of enrollees. Again, these examples pretend like COVID-19 doesn't exist. So we're not going to give the easy out here and say, well, of course our number of increased wages and enter employment is low because of COVID-19. Again, for this sake of argument, we're pretending it doesn't exist. We're saying no matter what, these numbers are low. We need to look at it. Next slide, please. So in this case, again, we're right-clicking the figures in the respective columns. So we're looking at our overall number of enrollees for CAEP outcomes. In this case, we're looking at the number who did enter employment. We're looking at the number who did increase wages and kind of comparing and contrasting. The key thing that we really think will be super duper useful here is running that CAEP DIR for the 3 different groups of students, in particular, that CAEP DIR for the 430 in this graphic. That is, we probably want to look at all the enrollees, not just the ones that reported positively. That is, we want to look at all enrollees and kind of figure out who might have missed it because of hours, who might have missed it because of other outcomes, who might have missed it because of drop reasons, and so on. But what we're saying is we can look at the 3 reports. We can look at the DIR again for just these 430. And in particular, we're going down to 25A and B for employment and 26A and B for wages and doing that comparison. Next slide, please. I don't want to go too far in the weeds here. Next slide, please. So, okay, so anyway, we can compare and we can look specifically at the number in 25A versus the number in 25B. So again, the figures here might be lower, but the process for evaluating the results is the same. So we're going to do the same thing where we're going to compare the number in A to the number in B. That is, we're going to compare the number that were just bubbled or checked versus the number that officially qualified as a CAEP outcome. If those numbers are exactly the same, well, then we know that in terms of recording demographics and recording hours and recording all that stuff, we've done as good a job as we can because our numbers are the same. But if we look at A and B and we get an appreciable difference, well, then that suggests that we did a lot of bubbling, but that, a lot of people aren't showing up on our CAEP summary. So if that's the case, it might well be that we've got missing hours, missing demographics. That is things that we still might be able to fix. So overall, what we're saying is all this whole process that we use for fixing issues really isn't changing a lick for COVID-19. None of that is really changing. What's changing is just the bar we're using in terms of determining what's really a good result versus what's really a bad result. That's what's changing. So in a normal year, we would expect to get really good employment results. We would expect to get really good pre-post testing results. But because it's COVID-19, again, the process for evaluating is no different, but we just have to kind of realize that our overall numbers and percentages are guaranteed to be a little bit lower, a little bit more troubling for all the reasons, for all those obvious reasons. Okay, next example, please. So here we're saying this should have been example number 1, quite frankly. So sorry, it's a little bit out of order. But example 2, we're just saying the number of CAEP outcomes is lower than expected and low when compared to the number of enrollees. So this should flesh out example 1 a little bit better than example 1 did, you might say, where we're going to look at items 23 to 27. Again, those are our CAEP specific items. Those are the areas that address all of our specific categories under AB 104. There's an A item that is 23A through 27A, which is simply saying this is the number that are officially earning outcomes on the CAEP summary, versus the B items, that is all the items from 23B through 27B, where you bubbled it correctly, you checked the right checkbox, but for whatever reason, they're not officially earning the CAEP outcome. Usually they're not earning the CAEP outcome because of some drop reason, usually to do with either missing demographics or less than 12 hours of instruction. So what we're saying is, if these numbers are sort of matching up, where you've got a large number under one of them. So let's look at 24 here, where we've got 14 that achieved the outcome. We only have 1 that achieved that had the right bubble mark but didn't achieve the outcome. So that, I'm saying, is an example where your data is very clean. You're only losing 1 person because of unclean data. In that case, you might say, yeah, that might most likely just be a COVID-19 casualty. We've got our data about as clean as it's going to get, but we're just not earning that many outcomes. And, hey, we're stuck because we're in COVID-19. On the other hand, if you look at 23A and 23B, you can see the number that we're losing is almost as big as the number that we successfully got recorded. So knowing that we lost a lot of outcomes because our data wasn't clean, those are good examples of ones where we might still want to follow up and check in on it. Again, that's the same series of items I put in italics 8 or 10 slides ago, where sometimes that's going to be something you can still fix despite COVID-19 if it's, missing gender, missing date of birth, race and ethnicity, that sort of stuff. No reason whatsoever why you can't fix that this year, just like you can fix that any other year. On the other hand, if you're just not recording enough earned employment outcomes, or you're not recording enough transition to post-secondary or employment outcomes,
well then, yeah, because of COVID-19, that might be a really, really difficult thing to fix. So that's one that you might need to, that might be one that you just have to throw your hands up in the air and say, yeah, we're not going to fix that. You know, so 23A is 0 and 23B is 33. So yeah, that's a good 23A is 0. Well, it would be hard. So yeah, flip that. Okay, thank you. Yes, as long as you flip that, that's a good example of one that you're probably not going to be able to fix. So I gave you an extreme example with 14 and 1. All you're doing is just giving a more extreme example of 33 and 0. So yeah, if you have 33 that achieve the outcome and there's literally nobody that had it marked but didn't successfully earn the outcome, that's a good example of one where, yeah, you've probably pushed the envelope about as far as you're going to push it because, you've pushed that envelope about as far as you want to push it. So yeah, I'm not saying there's no way you can improve, but yeah, that's an example where probably you're not going to go much further because at that point you can do better data-wise, but it's going to require you to get more employment outcomes or get more pay raises or get more transition to post-secondary or whatever. That is the things that you know are probably severely or directly impacted by COVID-19 and are not numbers you can simply improve by cleaning up your data a little bit. So yeah, if it's 33 in A and 0 in B, then that suggests that you've got a problem, but it's all to do with missing outcomes and absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with keeping your data clean. So that was a really good question, Adrian, and you fixed your flip it just as I was explaining it. So thank you for putting that follow-up chat right as it was coming out of my mouth. Your timing couldn't have been any better. So thank you for that. Next slide. I think after Adrian's question, that it should be clear. So again, here we're just given the same examples that I already gave, and so did Adrian. So next slide here. Here's another example. Again, next slide here. Sorry, I didn't realize I had so many examples. This is what I wanted to go to, where again, for this year, the number of CAEP outcomes may be lower than expected, and increasing those outcomes may not be possible. So to your example, Adrian, you're basically saying, yeah, my data's clean, but my outcomes are fair to partly cloudy. So again, knowing that we're in COVID-19, it's going to be tough to get more employment outcomes. It's going to be tough to get more transition to post-secondary outcomes. So if that's what the DIR is saying your problem is, most likely, yeah, you do kind of have to give up and say, yeah, it's COVID-19. We can't do much better DIR-wise than what we show here. On the other hand, if they're close together in indicating, yeah, there are a lot of, mark the outcome but not achieving it, those are the areas where you can follow up, because those are the areas where you might be able to fix your way through some problems simply by cleaning up your data. So again, what we're saying is increasing outcomes, easier said than done, but fixing these generic data issues really shouldn't be any different this year than any other year. Next slide, please. Okay, so last example. This is an oldie but goodie as well, where the number of pre-post learning gains is low as compared to the number of enrollees. And yes, I left this one in here on purpose, knowing that a lot of you are going to have bad numbers in terms of pre-post. But again, this is going to be one of the thornier ones that we all kind of need to deal with. So I'll just say, even though we know our numbers are going to be worse, this is one that I would recommend as much, if not more than others, that you still want to kind of reconcile and go through these steps to kind of figure out if there's anything to fix here. So in this case, we'll start by just pretending COVID-19 doesn't exist. The number of learning gains is low, especially when you look at the number of enrollees in our program. So you see, we've got 72 learners in ESL, only 14 made a gain. We've got 46 in ABE, only 15 made a gain. Both of those suggest kind of dismal results. For now, we're just assuming that it's, you know, a normal year. Next slide, please. So what we're doing is to start the same general guidance as we give any other year. Compare columns C and D. That is, compare the number who have a pre and post test with the number who make an EFL gain. So in this case, you know, again, we may not really be able to do much to improve the numbers, but we can at least determine whether these numbers are the same or whether they're fall apart. In this case, we know they're fall apart. They are far apart. That is the most likely reason for our low performance in ABE and ESO in this example, is because we didn't get a lot of them pre and post tested. So again, the way that we're evaluating our data here is going to be kind of the same as what we do any other year, where we're basically going to be evaluating, did we get everybody tested, yes or no? If we did get everybody tested, that's great. We may not be able to improve it much, but at least we know, and we know where we need to improve. If we can't do that, again, same thing applies, where we didn't get everybody tested, but we know why everybody, you know, might be doing that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. All right, so again, these are just the same examples we've had for a year or longer. Ways where you can reconcile it, again, just by comparing those two columns. You're not going to know just by looking at it in every situation whether it was a COVID-19 casualty or some other issue, but there are things you can review to kind of identify that. Generate NRS monitor. The solution for how to follow up on any disparity between those columns is the same. Run that NRS monitor. You know, look and see what's going on with your students. In this case, you can kind of look at the testing dates, and by looking at those dates, by looking at the scores, you know, you can kind of look and see, is this something that was created by COVID-19, yes or no? Maybe there are ways where we can fix some things, you know, with this. You know, again, probably not, but we can at least kind of evaluate and see what's causing the problem. Next slide. And so we can also create the DIR, so we can look at these numbers in this example, look at our 72 ESL enrollees, look at our 46 ABE enrollees, and so on, run the DIR, and in particular, look at items 8, 9, and 10. Items 8, 9, and 10 are the three areas on the DIR, and this is true for CAEP DIR, payment points DIR, and NRS DIR. Items 8, 9, and 10 on all three DIRs relate to pre and post testing, so you can drill down and find more details, you know, when you look at those kind of reports as well. Next slide, please. So overall, what we're saying is we know that our performance and our persistence rates will change substantially this year. The ability to capture a pre-post on everybody, way worse this year than it is in a normal year. The ability to capture lots of students with significant learning gains, way worse this year than in a normal year. But the basic idea of knowing whether our data is the way it is because of performance in the classroom, or whether it is the way it is because we're simply not capturing enough pre-post pairs, that should remain the same. So there'll be a limited amount that we can do on improving pre-post results, but we still can use this data to evaluate our strengths and weaknesses. We can still use this data to move forward and figure out what we need to do in the future with all of these different issues. So next slide, I think we're wrapping up. So this is just to piggyback. We've been talking a lot about this the last 6 months or so, where again, you can use this to determine, is performance good or bad? Is persistence good or bad? And we've talked a lot about use your performance and persistence as a good way forward to determine where you need to pick up. If you know that persistence is bad, then you know that you need to get more testing done, clean up data, whatever. Other times, you've done everything you can do here. If you've done everything you can do with testing and data cleanup, then you might need to look more at the classroom. You could certainly run DIR by program.
Jay, you muted yourself.
Veronica, can you go back a slide or two? Sorry. So good. So this is fine right here. So yeah, so to your question, Connie, sure, you could run it. You would just want to, in this case, right click on that column that's in purple where you'd right click on everybody in ESL, right click on everybody in ABE, right click on everybody in Career Tech Ed, whatever, but just right click on the number of enrollees, either in column B or in column E. That is, just right click on one of those purple shaded columns, and that's exactly what you're saying. That's running the DIR for all students that qualified for one particular CAEP program. Okay, we can move forward here, sorry. I just wanted to backtrack to all of that. So I think that's the very last slide, but I guess you can go forward. I don't think I have any after that one. That one was just kind of, so that's it for slides. We've got 3 minutes to spare. Anybody with any other questions in these 3 minutes we got? And I'll just say, hopefully this is all right. You've gotten cat meowing, you've gotten wind chimes, you've gotten airplanes. I think you've gotten a little bit of everything in this one. Sorry, there's not a lot I can do about some of those things. Okay, and I'll turn this over to Veronica. I think they were asking about recordings and links and that sort of stuff.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. We hope that it was helpful and you received a lot of great information. To answer, I think it was, I can't see anymore, but to answer attendees' question regarding recording, yes, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on our website later on this afternoon. We're going to post the URL now of exactly where it will be posted. So the recording will be there, as well as the PowerPoint presentation and the DIR summary handout. So all of those resources will be made available to you. Holly just posted, she just posted the registration link, but she'll also post the webpage of where everything will be. Speaking of registration, with the new agreement, Neil has opened up an office hour for this Friday. So the office hour will take place this Friday, June 26th, beginning at 1:00 p.m. to discuss the budget agreement. We just opened registration prior to this webinar, so the URL is posted in the chat for you to register for that webinar. So definitely register for that. We have opened up our next iteration of regional network meetings, which will take place beginning of August. So definitely register for those as well. And then we also have a CAEP beginning of the year data and accountability webinar scheduled for August 5th with Neil, Jay, as well as Randy Tillery from WestEd. So they'll be there to do a beginning of the year data and accountability webinar. That is all that I have for you. I will close the room, but definitely feel free to complete our evaluation to let us know if there are any other topics that you would like us to host webinars for or trainings in the fall. We definitely utilize the information as we are planning our calendars. So thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.